from the website, which may fix any audio issues you may experience. Day one of the summit brought together members of the life sciences industry from Georgia and around the world to discuss how to tackle the challenges ahead, from future-proofing labs, building the right team, and managing risks, to overcoming racial inequality in healthcare and the power of collaboration across sectors. If you missed any of these, all the recordings are available in the system. Just go to the agenda and click on the one you're interested in. Also, please take a few minutes and check out the company showcase and pitch round that were featured on day one. Now, before moving into our first keynote of the day, I would like to thank champion and keynote sponsor Johnson & Johnson for their support of this morning's keynote. Making remarks on their behalf is George Hanisov, Director of State Government Affairs with J&J. George?
Thank you, Maria. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm George Hanisov, Director of State Government Affairs with Johnson & Johnson. And in addition to that role, on behalf of our team in North America, I am the lead for our medical device business, DePuy Synthes. And it's a pleasure to be in that capacity with you this morning, where I have just a couple of minutes to highlight a few things about Johnson & Johnson. I'll touch on our med device business. I'll speak briefly about J&J innovation, and then finally leave you with some of the work we're doing in this COVID-19 pandemic as it relates to medical devices. So first, just about the Johnson & Johnson medical device companies. You know, we try in this environment to make connections across science and technology to really combine and leverage the expertise we have in 4 areas, and those are orthopedics, surgery, interventional solutions, and vision care. So let me just quickly walk through those. So in terms of orthopedics, it's comprised of joint reconstruction, trauma, spine, sports medicine, and power tools, and we're one of the leading orthopedics companies in the world. For surgery, surgeons across the globe really rely on our Ethicon business, which is over 100 years old and producing instruments and surgical tools that surgeons can rely on in hospitals around the world. In terms of interventional solutions, our medical device portfolio encompasses a range of innovative business segments that focus on tools for treating heart rhythm disorders and neurovascular care. And finally, in vision, we have cutting-edge science and technology that's really trying to promote and advance eye health across the world and really improve access to quality eye care in countries that do not have it. We currently have over 10,000 employees just in vision care alone and reach over 100 countries across the globe. I mentioned Johnson & Johnson Innovation. That's a model that's comprised of complementary teams that bring meaningful solutions and really flexible solutions to support collaboration across a number of areas, including innovation and incubation hubs known as J Labs. It also includes early stage investing, venture funding, and acquisition, really just trying to bring a full range of capabilities to startup companies, biotechs, all those entrepreneurs that are in the external environment working to bring innovative medical device solutions to patients. And the last thing I'll leave you with is a campaign that we created called My Health Can't Wait. And really, that's been in response to this COVID-19 pandemic, where patients and individuals across the United States are deferring or delaying routine care, surgeries, and procedures for fear of not wanting to go into a hospital setting because of COVID. In fact, some statistics show that in excess of 2/3 of people are delaying care that they should be getting in this current environment. So we created My Health Can't Wait, which is a campaign that fundamentally is an education and resource hub that provides a few things for people who are interested in learning more. And one is a patient caregiver checklist, a resource guide that helps patients understand what they should be talking to their provider about. The second is a frequently asked questions document on basic safety, what it's like to return to a healthcare setting, a hospital or community healthcare facility. And finally, just some basics on telehealth, telehealth 101, to get people comfortable with that new medium as a way to deal with addressing their healthcare needs in the COVID environment. And, fundamentally, J&J, we're a Credo-based company, and our first priority is always to patients. So we're trying to do our part in helping ensure that patients get the care and the access that they need during this difficult pandemic. So with that, I really appreciate the opportunity to represent J&J here today. And Maria, I turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, George, and thank you again to J&J. Now on to our keynote address. COVID-19 is reshaping the medtech industry. Permanent adoption of remote tech, changes to clinical trials, and rethinking where medtech employees work are among the phenomena poised to stick around. This morning, we have an esteemed panel of executives from industry that I am sure will provide us with insights on these changes. I'm now going to turn this over to Ken Berta, Executive Director of our newest division, the Global Health Crisis Coordination Center, or GHC3. Ken?
Thank you, Maria. And thank you, everyone, for joining this session. I'd also like to thank our esteemed panel and introduce them. With us today, we have Pat Obermeyer from Microsoft's Health and Life Sciences. We have Dan Brady, Philip's Connected Care, and Steve Laser, who's with Dell's Healthcare and Life Sciences Group. Today, we're going to talk about, as the title mentions, devices and data and the impact on the healthcare continuum. To set that up, I'll talk a little bit about the healthcare continuum, which is the strata of wellness, or healthy living, working through prevention and behavioral management, screening for early detection, diagnosis for rapid and acute diagnosis, treatment and targeted therapies. A lot of that feeds back into how this data can be leveraged with the life sciences industry to develop new therapies. Recovery, rehabilitation, and accelerating the return to that healthy living, and turning back around into monitoring and measuring the effectiveness of interventions. So as we work with care teams across this continuum in a way that provides better experiences for patients, improves efficiency, reduces non-clinical workflows so that the experience of delivering healthcare is also improved and less stressful, and beginning to lower costs and yield better health outcomes. I wanted to pick on a few specific topics to really explore. First, as we look at remote patient monitoring, as George said, there are new technologies out there that people work with today. More and more individuals are wearing biometric devices to help them understand their current health conditions. I'm wearing my Apple Watch today. I've got my Whoop band, which also tells me how well I'm sleeping and what my recovery rates are. So there's a lot of high fidelity data that can be captured and analyzed to support diagnostics, monitor the decisions being made around specific health therapies. And I like to ask, how do we see these merging together? How do we align all of this data that's available now out there for an individual patient? And how do we use that and really share it across the healthcare continuum so that we can see just more collaboration from different parts of how care is delivered, from home care all the way through urgent care and acute care and post-acute care. There's a lot of care delivery cycles involved there, and there's a lot of data that needs to cross over. So I'll start with Patty, if she could share a little bit about what Microsoft's view is on that and some of the unique programs they have.
Sure, thanks, Ken. So I'll make a distinction, I think, between medical devices and consumer devices. Remote monitoring, as you were mentioning, your blood pressure, your weight, your glucose level, the number of steps you're taking. We all have a multitude of different devices out there, and they have been and can provide value in terms of reducing readmissions to hospitals and, of course, improving patient outcomes. But the drive to virtual health that we saw exacerbated by the pandemic is really driving the move to a very connected medical remote monitoring. And we see this growing over the next few years. And at Microsoft, we spent a lot of time talking about the Internet of Medical Things and how do we create that connectivity to ultimately capture all that data. We're also seeing a move to remote monitoring clinical trials as well, and working on initiatives around having a clinical trial in a box, if you will. So when you are a patient, as part of that clinical trial, your box of all your remote monitors are able to come in. For us, we really see it at the convergence of pulling in the data, AI, so that we're ultimately, as you mentioned, can improve the health continuum or improve the experience for the patients. We're working with Children's Mercy Hospital, I'll use them as an example. They have a remote monitoring app called CHAMP, which is integrating predictive analytics and AI so that we can help children that are born with singular ventricle disease to be able to be monitored so that we can, if possible, avoid any type of fatal health challenge that may exist out there. And through that monitoring and through the predictiveness of AI, and if you start to capture these signals, we can, as you mentioned, bring an intervention and hopefully improve that life or save that life in the case of the work we're doing at Children's Mercy. So I think the opportunities are endless, Ken, of how we can pull in data and the remote monitoring and drive improved outcomes for our patients.
Excellent. Thank you. Dan, I know that Philips has one of the broadest patient monitoring portfolios today. I'd like to ask you the same on looking across all of the different techniques in clinical data acquisition and the high fidelity data that your team pulls together. What are some of the ways integration can also happen outside of the hospital, as Patty was mentioning?
Yeah, so I think it's an amazing opportunity to leverage where we can go. And I think, one of the big challenges today has always been privacy in healthcare and data access. And COVID is certainly changing that. It's changing mindsets within consumers and their willingness to provide data in exchange for care at a level of quality they didn't have an opportunity to get remotely before. So from a Philips standpoint, we absolutely have been a major player in this area of remote patient monitoring, and we've seen just an absolute shift in the willingness for both patients and for hospitals to get involved, especially given some of the reimbursement changes. We think about virtual care being the future of medicine. That's something that Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Dr. Wilkie, has said is that it's a most powerful emerging tool. And as we look at just the predicted growth in this area and where we're going to go, 2020 has really blown the cover off. And I think it's just going to change healthcare pretty much forever. When we look from Philips' standpoint, we're looking at the home environment, but we're actually expanding beyond that. We're looking at what's happening from the hospital scenario as you come to the hospital, as you transition care between settings. And that's where, Patty, I agree with what you said related to the predictive analytics. We can really help understand what's happening with a patient in the future, what could happen, and how we can head that off. And then, of course, moving that patient into a home environment is something that really is going to change the world of monitoring and the connection with the doctor. So as we look at the world and where it's going and the role Philips can play in this, it's really going to expand. We feel like the connectivity between the consumer and the patient, and also, the consumer and the doctor, as well as between providers, is going to change forever. And we're excited to play a role in that.
All righty. Thanks, Dan. Steve, I know Dell has done a lot of work on the integration and normalization of data and also data security. So, from an infrastructure perspective and even from a delivery perspective, what are some of the things that Dell's working on?
From a Dell Technologies perspective, we have been working with organizations to support the integration and normalization of data throughout the years through tool sets that we have acquired simply to run our own business. Their expanded use is the ability to go ahead and provide that same functionality to go ahead and support healthcare data. As you look at where healthcare data is going, first of all, we see this overwhelming flood of data coming in from all of those sensors, whether they be clinical or non-clinical, and whether or not they're FDA certified or not. I think that we see the value in that data more, especially if they're non-FDA regulated devices, from a trending perspective, and being able to provide indications as to where healthcare is going. If you look at it from a clinical device perspective, again, a tremendous volume of data, which is where things like AI and other high performance compute capabilities really start to make a play here from an inferencing perspective to help us understand what are the important data points. If you look at where healthcare data was, if I go back even 9 months ago, looking at how we collected data around patients, everyone was afraid to turn on data collection because of the volume of data points that we would collect. And to Patty's point, utilization of things like machine learning capabilities to understand what is normal for a patient, utilizing AI capabilities to help normalize that data that's coming in and provide us appropriate alerts, appropriate inferencing as to what's happening with the patient are absolutely required. Otherwise, we will overwhelm our clinicians and providers with so much data that they can't keep up. And if we collect the data, they're responsible to keep up with that data. As you look at how we go ahead and start to trim that data down and bring that data in from whether they be edge collection devices, whether they be centralized collection devices, we need to find ways to make sure that we surface the appropriate amount of data to those folks so that they can make appropriate decisions and make clinical decisions that are in the best interest of our patients and our providers.
Excellent. Alrighty. Was clinical decision support, I think, is key, and I think we're seeing a lot more applications layered against how clinicians do their work every day. But we're also looking at, as both all of you have mentioned here, in looking at how telehealth is coming on, and it really extending the boundaries of how health has really been delivered. And I've experienced myself a few doctor's appointments now that really showed off how effective telehealth can be without having to drive into the office and sit in a waiting room and really expose myself to this virus, but also I can be doing other things while I'm waiting to get there. So it's been very convenient for me. As we look at this increase in telehealth, what are some of the challenges? I know there's technological challenges. There's obviously the use of video as a challenge. The ability to connect devices remotely is a challenge. So I'd like to throw that out to all of you on what you see as some of the challenges we yet need to overcome, and where we might be coming with some of the payables too. That has also been a barrier in how we can lever remote and telehealth visits. So I'll kick that back over to Patty for now, and then I'll go to Dan.
Happy to do that. And of course, that's when the dogs start barking. So my apologies if you hear that. We show up as we are today in our lives, right?
That's right.
I get really excited about telehealth because prior to COVID, we had, probably about 0.5% of our visits overall were telehealth. And then around May, we hit about 14%. It's tapered down a little bit. And then I heard a statistic the other day that 60% of Medicare patients have experienced telehealth visits since February, which just shows the adoption is incredible. And for me, as a technologist in healthcare, we were hitting some adoption barriers, if you will, around telehealth prior to COVID. And it was amazing to see some customers that had 60,000 providers that said, we got to deploy telehealth in over a weekend, go run, get it done real quick. So the appetite for the adoption has been huge, which is wonderful. And I think it's going to continue to be there. What I like about it most as a patient, and Ken, you talked about experienced telehealth, and I did as well, especially when I dislocated my shoulder while running in the woods, another activity during COVID that probably shouldn't be doing, but I got to experience what it was like going through the telehealth visit, and they're definitely here to stay. I mean, I kind of look at this for those of us that have been around technology for a while. If you think about the mobile device and how excited we were when we could deploy apps on a mobile device, because it was any app, anywhere, anytime, any place in the world. And now I feel like we're almost at that same with health, where as a patient, I can decide when I get the care, where I get it, if I go into a hospital or a doctor's office or do it by telemedicine. And in some cases, I can decide who, right? I can go to Teladoc and get a virtual doc, or I can do a televisit with my primary doc. So we definitely have gotten over the technology curve adoption. I worry more so, candidly, about some inequities that we're going to face and some of the initiatives that we're working around broadband to bring broadband to everybody, especially in rural America and other communities, so that everybody can have access to telehealth. So I don't think it's a technology right now. We have reimbursement issues, but I also think it's a broadband, and how do we expand that out to everyone so they can experience it.
Excellent. And Dan, I know your team has really looked at how to expand, specifically with your VA project, how to get to those rural areas to deliver telehealth more effectively. How's that been going, and what have been some of the challenges there in getting to those rural areas?
Yeah, I think access to care is really the new focus for so many of us. And as we look at the new telehealth environment, creating a level playing field to really provide that true access to care. But I also think that it provides an opportunity. Since we've had this shift, now we can look at putting remote pods, let's say in a Walmart, let's say, or another government establishment where most people could go and access the care in a private world and access their doctors in a way they never could before. So reaching out in new ways is certainly a new possibility for us and a new opportunity. I'd say that as it relates to telehealth, it was interesting, Ken, as we went through the whole crisis in the beginning, speed became currency, and good is good enough. And it was interesting because healthcare never had played that way before. And in the past, it was always about doing what we needed to do as an organization to be somewhat perfect, right? And not Philips, I mean, we as an industry trying to be somewhat perfect. And at the moment it became, if you can bring an iPad in from home and we can put it on a stick and we can monitor a patient through any number of mechanisms, that's what we're going to do, because we don't have the full robust system to expand capabilities. At Philips, we were very fortunate that we have a tele-ICU solution, which allows nurses and physicians to monitor patients remotely. And as organizations expanded, at Philips, we just opened up the licenses to allow them to do what they had to do to serve their populations. They were shutting down units and turning them into makeshift ICUs. And so the ice has now been broken, not only in the hospital from that standpoint. I think we'll be better prepared for the next wave as we seem to be working our way into it, but also the ice has been broken beyond that. And the conversations have shifted to two things. One, how do we take that same level of care and maybe step it down within hospitals? And then as we look out to true telehealth outside of the hospital environment, what are the limits? What are the boundaries? And I think that it really starts with access to care. It starts with providing, services to those that wouldn't normally have it. And I think that's where remote patient monitoring, what we talked about before, comes into play as well. I do believe that people will have access to healthcare like they've never had before. And it's a matter of evolving from the good is good enough to what is a real environment that we can work through. And then, as Stephen knows, from a data standpoint, that's just a big challenge as well, moving that data back and forth. So we're up for the task. I think it's an evolution that we're in the middle of. And I think that the ice has been broken and we'll never go back to where we were.
All right. Well, let's take off on that, Steve. If we look at all of the data now that can be captured, including all the video of these visits, the advanced camera technologies, where does all that information go? If I want to replay a visit that I had with my doctor to go over those instructions again, you're going to see a lot more of these features happening. Storage is going to be quite important, and access to that capability. What are your thoughts there?
I think as we start looking at where this is going, I want to back up our conversation and move our conversation from a televisit or telehealth visit to more of a virtual care conversation, first of all, and bringing that into really a data-rich experience between what I'll call the constituent rather than the patient and their caregivers, and whether their caregivers are their circle of care family of caregivers or whether those caregivers are the paid professional caregivers. I think as we start to look at where this is going, and yes, all this data is data that is collectible. At this time, CMS is not requiring collection of video visits as a part of this, but I think that will eventually change. Either that or liability will drive that change for someone to want to go ahead and be able to collect that video visit and retain that data. But as we look at that data-rich experience and look at how we can share that data, utilize that data, having somewhere to land that data suddenly becomes a very, very important part of the conversation and how we think about what else we can do with that data. As we start to think about it from what other good can come from that data, Ken, you and I have had many, many conversations on data collection in many different facets and different directions about how we can utilize data to do greater good within the world and really start to deliver better population health, better care, and Patty, you brought up the conversation of looking at clinical studies and the ability to go ahead and conduct those clinical studies electronically. But let's go ahead and take that even a little bit further. So now that we've collected a bunch of data, what would happen if we conducted a clinical study just on the data itself in the concept of what is known as digital twin? And really starting to look at how that digital twin can represent the embodiment of that living organism of a person in order to go ahead and support that clinical study against data rather than against that person, and not putting people at risk, eliminating some of the challenges that we have, whether it's side effects from whatever the study is, or whether it's risk in other forms from the study. How do we go ahead and change that perspective and look at it very, very differently? Not only that, the capabilities exist for us to collect the data near instantaneously. Dan, as you mentioned in your remote ICU capabilities, you have the ability to actually see the impact of a drug administered to an ICU patient and be able to go ahead and look at that and eventually collect enough data that we can understand what is happening, what's trending with that patient. And if we look at it in near real time, we can potentially even get into prediction algorithms that will help us stop adverse events.
All right.
Data is absolutely where this is all going. There's no question, and whether it's from a virtual care perspective, whether it's from a remote ICU perspective, also what I would call a virtual experience, we have the ability to get there. We just need to take the next steps. And bringing the payer side of this conversation into the discussion, making sure that our clinicians can be appropriately compensated for the work that they do, whether it be physical or from a virtual perspective, is going to be, I think, the next big hurdle.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. Ken, if I may just add one
Sure.
piece to it, what Stephen was mentioning there. As I look at this, there's two pieces. There's the extending and the enhancing of healthcare. Extending, we already talked about consumer access and convenience. The staffing and capability. So that's really extending that throughout the healthcare environment. And something I just thought of from Stephen's comments is just the enhancing piece, which means so much. And a lot of that's about care continuity and then confidence. And that data element really will change the game as it relates to the consumer confidence in what we're doing. So we look at enhancing it in their confidence, and then also looking at like the system efficiency and sustainability as we move forward with making better decisions, having more predictive algorithms, trying to help us understand, what's going to transpire with this patient in the next hours, days and weeks. So I think very interesting and appropriate points, Stephen. Appreciate that very much.
All righty. Well, I'm going to, and I appreciate the comments there. I think that a lot of the high fidelity data that can be captured on patients as drugs are being delivered can also, to your point, really feed back into an extensible change in how clinical trials can be done. I'm going to change the topic a little bit here and take off on something Patty mentioned, and that's really what is the equity of health. One of the things GHC3 has been dealing with as the Global Health Crisis Coordination Center, looking at how COVID has impacted specific populations, even in the US, to look at what perhaps those social determinants are on their ability to fight off this disease. It really leads to what are the impact on those social determinants in health. And I was reading a recent study on from RWJ on the foundation on that highlights 80% of a lot of the factors contributing to our health outcomes are related to those social determinants, really broken down into those economic factors. What are our personal health behaviors? What physical environment do we live in? This indicates that there's perhaps 20% of health outcomes are directly impacted by clinical care. Then we look at these two data types and how they can be merged together. How would you apply the data gathering capabilities of some of the devices we've talked about already in screening and other things, but targeting them more specifically to certain subpopulations of the US and around the world, to know that these individuals in these subgroups are impacted more heavily than others by certain disease types and certain indications of disease. So as we look at health equity in general, I like to pick on that topic a little bit and hear from the panel on what your thoughts are around that. And I'll start with you, Patty.
Sure, thanks for that, Ken, because the social determinants of health, we have a fair amount of work and research going into this area because it's a challenging one, right? In terms of we can measure health outcomes, but when you add in all these other critical elements, as you mentioned, in terms of where you live, socioeconomics, education levels, access to a car to get to the doctor, it gets a little bit challenging. From the hospitals that I work with, about a year ago or so, we started doing a lot of work with them on making sure that they were asking the right questions, especially when they were releasing patients from the hospital, to make sure that they could get back to the hospital or that they would take and follow up on their medications so that they wouldn't have a readmission coming back into it. Behavioral economics here teaches us that if we nudge people in the right direction, we can have a good intervention. And so by applying that, I think, to health and wellness and the continuum of care will be very helpful. Stephen talked about digital twins. It'll be interesting to see what role they'll play in interventions, especially around as it relates to social determinants of health and how we can start to change it. And we do a lot of work, and I work with one of the leading experts who was formerly with Dartmouth Atlas on the zip code that you live in determines your life expectancy. And it doesn't necessarily mean because you live in an affluent zip code that you'll have a longer expectancy. It's also the the standards of care that are applied within that area. So it's a lot of work. We saw it very much highlighted during COVID-19, especially with all of our work with the provider organizations in New York in particular, and the folks that knew if they went to the hospital, they would get a warm meal and they may not have access to food. They would get care, whether they have COVID-19 or not, they could get in and be seen for whatever ailment that they may have. And we had to work, Microsoft was doing a fair amount of work in that community around the country with how do we work with Uber to get people to the doctors and back again? How do we work with the social services organizations to make sure that they've got food? We teamed up with Kroger to deliver food kits to folks that were in isolation because food is health to a certain extent. So it's a pretty complex question that you're asking, Ken, but I think with that focus on the research and telling us where we're going with much more capturing and patient reported outcomes, we always think those outcomes are related to drug interactions or their ailments, but also just asking the questions. Do you have access to a car? Do you have access to food? What do you need? Will be pretty important as we start to look at changing how we're delivering care in this country.
Excellent. Steve, we've worked a little bit on how we can get monitoring devices into those vulnerable populations. I know that's been a somewhat of a focus of the folks at Dell, but it also leads to how do we get devices out to that population, as Patty was pointing out earlier, and mechanisms to collect that data. What kind of challenges do you see there in being able to really move digital health further into all populations?
As we start to look at what's out there today and what's reachable and accessible, there are a few things that are starting to play into our favor. As you look at communications throughout the world, communications are expanding. Majority of what we look at from whether it be a virtual care perspective or a remote patient monitoring perspective does not typically require that we think about things like 5G. Now, 5G is an added benefit without a doubt and gives us much greater bandwidth and capabilities, potentially extended range as we start to look at some of the other technologies coming out of 5G and a little more stable connectivity. But with that, it's absolutely not a requirement to go ahead and start some of this monitoring. Simple things like satellite access, the ability to go ahead and provide connectivity or transmission capabilities when connection is available and hold data when the connection is not available are things that we've looked at as we looked at some deployments, especially over in Botswana. Looking at other deployments out in the Middle East where connectivity is generally very, very good, but at the same time, distances are very great. And you may see things like food deserts as you start to look at how that population lives and exists. How do we provide connectivity and capabilities there to understand where those people are? How do we communicate with them? How do we get them to an area where we can affect them from a population perspective and really start to change that perspective of what that communication and what that healthcare picture looks like?
Excellent. And Dan, I know that Philips has worked globally on trying to get devices out to the edges. Are there other things you're seeing there in the ability to deliver and manage that going forward?
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. So this one really hits close to home for Philips. One of our goals is impacting 2.5 billion lives by 2030, and that's certainly a global life comment there. And as we look at this, I'll actually use an example maybe more close to home. So access to care and comparable care, a couple things that we've hit on so far in our conversation today. So access, of course, being important, and I agree with the comments that were made previously. And then as it relates to comparable care, how are we going to do that? And I guess the question becomes, in our current healthcare environment in the US, we may need to start leaning on state and government programs differently than we ever had. So in today's environment, these hospitals are serving, whether they're profit or nonprofit, a community, and they're leveraging that environment. And we may need to think a little bit more broadly about that. Conversations with state agencies as it relates to, rural healthcare telehealth programs, that we can put out there, and thinking about the government, not just the VA and access to care for all the veterans, whether they're here or, somewhere around the world, but also how do we manage the Indian Health Services population? How do we impact that life, those lives in there, and the care that those individuals are getting. So when we think about areas of focus and opportunities, that's really what I think we need to continue to strive on. And Philips has certainly got the opportunity to have a massive impact in these different areas, and we're aggressively seeking opportunities to do so.
All right, very, very important topic. I want to take off a little bit on the digital twin comment there, because I think over the past 20 years or so, and I've been working in healthcare for a long time, we'd always coined a phrase early on about the 40 terabyte patient, which may be even a little bit low now, as we look at all the imaging, molecular data, genetic data, and then all the biometric data we've been talking about here that can be captured about an individual. And that starts to build out now. Here's my health digitally. And as we then understand the control of that data, how do we move that? How do we as individuals share the data about ourselves? That becomes part of a challenge. I think it's been alluded to here a few times in what are we willing to allow people to access about ourselves? What's the security around my own information, and how can I share that? But also, how can that individual picture of me or my digital twin, as you've said, really start to impact how we look at the therapies being developed for the future? As we look at, I know Microsoft had worked on the Health Vault for many years to look at how we could maintain our data and how we can move that forward. Do we see the environment now moving more and more towards something like that? To me, that might have been a little ahead of its time, but I think we're coming back around, especially with all of the social media we now have. And some of those efforts really predated that social media rise, that us getting control over our own data becomes more important. So I'd like to get your all's thoughts on just how to manage your own information and what it can mean for the development of therapies in the future. So I'll start with Patty, since I threw out Health Vault. Sorry.
Listen, that was before my time in
Yes.
at Microsoft, though I was very involved with it in a prior life, but it was a little bit ahead of its time. I think that we are still strong believers that consumers or patients should have control of their data. I mean, if you think about it today, each person generates a gigabyte of data daily. And so that just begs the question, do we even know what we're generating, and two, where it's going and who's using it? It's the secondary uses of data that I always question and wonder about as we start putting all this information into apps and all kinds of things that we are using. I mean, if you just think about healthcare data alone, annually we are generating about 4 trillion gigabytes of data that's just going to double every 2 years based on the research that I've been looking at. At Microsoft, we're working on a couple of pilots as it relates to patients controlling their data. And one particular one I want to highlight, because I think it's important on how you use all this data that's out there, is related to rare diseases and some of the work that we're doing around applying AI and machine learning to reduce the diagnosis of time to an accurate diagnosis, because folks are living many, many years, if you have a rare disease, almost 5 years without getting an accurate diagnosis, especially. And you can imagine how that is very critical for kids or children that are living with rare diseases. And right now we have a blockchain-based patient registry that we're working on in conjunction with the Queen's University in Canada, where the patients will be able to store their healthcare data and then have control over it and be able to carry it along with them as they go from doctor to doctor to doctor. Now, obviously, you can imagine the number of doctors you're seeing if you've got a rare disease. And this is just one technology that we're testing and looking at. And I'm sure my colleagues here, Stephen and Dan, can speak as well to the work that they're doing. But
yeah.
And of course, for Microsoft, security and privacy underpins everything that we do. And we spend billions of dollars on making sure things are secure and private. But true believers that the patient owns access to their data. The question is, how can you know where it's going, the transparency of where it's gone, and what you can do to maintain it.
All right. Steve, what are your thoughts on that data portability?
Data portability becomes very, very important as we start to look at the amount of data that's being generated. And Patty, I think you're absolutely spot on with some of the conversation there. To me, the challenge around all of this data is the ability to give that control to the constituent or patient, however we want to refer to them, and really be able to have them be in control. The blockchain or distributed ledger conversation, I think, is an interesting starting place, but I don't think it goes far enough. I think it's just the beginning in order to be able to actually secure that data and give that person actual control over it. That, to me, is probably the biggest challenge that I see coming up in the next 3 to 5 years from a healthcare data perspective. With that, as we start to look at where we're going, provided we can actually secure that data and truly provide security to it, it suddenly becomes a question of how do I control that data for myself as a person? How do I share that data with those who I want to share it with? How do I control where it goes, how it's utilized? And, oh, by the way, how long do you have access to that data? And how do we go ahead and create that capability in order to go ahead and support whatever study we're participating in or whatever other information we're trying to share, at the same time be able to remove access to that data when time is appropriate. There are functions within the distributed ledger capabilities that can help support that. I don't think that technology is quite mature enough in order to provide the level of security I think that is necessary to allow us to go into that wholeheartedly. And Patty, be happy to have some other offline conversations with you on it and with Microsoft and see where we can go with that conversation.
All righty. Dan, I'll give you the opportunity to add before we close up.
Yep, I know we're kind of getting to the end of time here, so I'll just
yeah, there you go.
Few quick
Sure.
comments, sorry. So, just to wrap up, from our standpoint, I think, Philips looks at it a little bit differently than Patty and Stephen do for their respective businesses. We're really focused on the predictive components of how we can use the data. So I know this is a question about people's health and own personal data. And I think, one thing that's interesting, the more data you have, the more we all become doctors at home and try to figure out what's wrong with us, which can create its own challenges for the healthcare environment. And especially as we move into this telehealth world, there's a lot more potential questioning. And I think that's why earlier we talked about consistency and people being feeling that they're getting the right level of care and it's the appropriate level of care. But from a benchmarking standpoint, AI and ML, that is absolutely where we need to take all data, whether it's inside the hospital data that's really not being shared widely with patients, or we're taking everyone's consumer data. It's interesting that with social media, so many people put so much of their life out there and we know almost everything about them. But when it comes to the health data, it's really, held quite closely. And I think that's really going to change. And I think we'll have an incredible opportunity to do more with the data. But for us, we're really focused on how can we improve lives? How can we predict things that are going to happen? How can we model what's been in the past and really look into the future?
All righty. Well, thank you. And I'd like to thank our panel for the great discussion here this morning. And Maria, I'll turn that back over to you.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Ken. And thank you to our esteemed panels. Wow, that was really informative. And data's king, obviously, taken away from this. So I know we're a minute or two behind. So I just want to thank you again all for your time. And I now encourage everyone to join us for the exhibit hall to connect and learn more about the organizations within our community. To do so, just go to your exhibitors page and you can select which booth you want to view. And on that page, you can enter the virtual trade show booth to talk to our exhibitors. So please take a minute, drop in, say hi. Reconnect with a friend. It's been a long time, so I know a lot of people have seen each other, but we really appreciate all of our exhibitors who've joined us this week. Finally, as a reminder, the more you connect and interact with our sponsors, exhibitors, and attendees, the more conference points you earn and the better chance you have to win a prize at the end of the conference. And at 11:15, in about an hour, don't miss our next keynote featuring globally renowned public health experts, Dr. Bill Fagey, Helene Gale, and Seth Berkley. Their conversation will inspire and remind us all of the power of science and innovation and the legacies we leave behind. Thank you.
All righty.